April 3, 1943. A humid dawn over the Solomon Sea. The horizon glows faintly pink, but the clouds remain low and swollen, like bruises across the sky. The ocean below ripples with an uneasy rhythm, disturbed only by the distant silhouettes of Japanese transport ships grinding steadily toward New Georgia. Their decks glisten with early moisture, their anti-aircraft crews half awake, leaning against rails with the confidence of men who believe they control these waters dot above them. The faint hum begins. It's barely noticeable at first, just a tremor in the morning air, but within seconds the sound grows heavier, deeper, unmistakable. Twin Wright R2600 engines pushing through the haze at treetop height. Then the shape emerges, a B-25 Mitchell, but not the kind any engineer expected to survive a combat zone. Its nose is not glazed like the standard bomber. Instead, it is pack-filled entirely with a brutal array of .50 caliber machine guns jutting outward like the teeth of an iron predator. This aircraft is not what North American aviation designed. It is something else entirely patched, reinforced, modified on dirt floors and jungle workshops by crews who were told that such ideas were unworkable, unsafe, and impossible. But impossibility meant nothing here. Not to Major Paul Pappy Gunn, the former Navy machinist turned renegade engineer whose vision now cuts across the Pacific sky. The Japanese crews hear the sound too late. They expect the typical American bombing approach, high altitude, predictable direction, and easily bracketed by anti-aircraft fire. They expect slow, lumbering threats that can be studied and measured before being struck down. What they do not realize is that this B-25 is not climbing. It is descending, closer, lower, faster. It roars across the waves so tightly that the propellers slice the sea spray into mist dot inside the Mitchell. The smell of oil and cordite hangs thick in the metal interior. Ammunition belts thousands of rounds coil, like metallic serpents across the floor. Every .50 caliber cartridge gleams faintly in the dim cabin light. A recurring symbol of everything the American industrial machine represents: abundance. The ability to overwhelm with quantity where precision alone once stood, and the idea that a free nation can produce enough firepower for both survival and ingenuity. The pilots of the Japanese convoy had trained for years believing American aircraft were predictable. They studied diagrams showing standard bomber behavior. They memorized ranges of the usual nose guns and turret arcs. Here, doctrine had convinced them that close-range strafing from bombers was rare, reckless, and ultimately suicidal. They expected the Americans to behave like textbook pilots, rigid, mechanical, cautious. But what they actually experienced was a B-25 hurtling toward them at mass height, its modified nose guns already spitting fire before the ship's alarm sirens could fully awaken. The .50 caliber shells punch across the deck with a ferocity few Japanese sailors had ever seen. Wood shatters. Metal tears open. Ammunition crates erupt. The air fills with splinters and smoke. The first transport's forward section is shredded before the gunners can swing their barrels around. 3 days earlier, no one in Allied command believed such a machine could exist, let alone dominate a naval convoy. Engineers reviewing guns' modifications described them as unsafe, weight imbalance, structurally unsound. Reports used phrases like exceeds airframe tolerance, mechanically irregular, and not suitable for combat environments. They insisted that a bomber must drop bombs from altitude, not behave like a fighter-bomber hybrid. Gunn ignored them. Combat necessity rarely waits for paperwork. The transformation of the B-25 into a low-altitude gunship began months earlier in New Guinea. After suffering heavy losses due to ineffective high-altitude bombing, pilots realized they needed a weapon capable of ripping into ships before anti-aircraft guns could react. Gunn studied the airframe, measured balance points, tore out unnecessary compartments, welded additional mounts, and installed up to 8 forward-firing, 50 caliber machine guns in the nose alone. He added more on the sides, turning the aircraft into a flying wall of automatic fire. Every new gun increased weight, But every new gun also increased possibility. And possibility mattered more than risk. By the time this April morning arrived, this impossible design had become real deadly, reliable, and fully integrated into the new doctrine of skip bombing and strafing that the Allied forces desperately needed. Now, as the B-25 levels out barely above the waves, the Japanese sailors see the impossible in motion. They witness bombs released so low they bounce once skipping across the water like stones before slamming into ship holes at the waterline. They see the Mitchell rise only slightly, just enough to avoid mass, then banking hard and coming around for another run, while other B-25s arrive to join the attack. The Japanese expected the standard threat. Instead, they were confronted with a weapon that tore apart the boundaries between bomber and attack plane. The historical record of these 3 days, April 3rd to April 5th, 1943, comes not from Allied exaggeration, but from careful accounting after the war. Reports from the Japanese 8th Fleet record the loss of 12 ships, including transports, destroyers, and supply vessels critical to sustaining the New Georgia campaign. Some sank within minutes. Others burned for hours before sliding beneath the waves. Many were struck by combinations of skip bombs and strafing fire from the very B-25 gunships that engineers once dismissed as impractical fantasies. On land, Allied air crews hearing the returning engines gathered around the battered gunships. Oil streaks ran across the fuselage. Empty shell casings piled along the floor like spent tokens of survival. Each .50 caliber cartridge represented a choice. One more second of life for the aircrew, one more second of pressure on the enemy, one more reminder that American factories powered by citizens, rather than coerced labor, could produce weapons faster than an empire could replace its losses. The emotional contrast of this engagement is written in the recollections of both sides. Japanese survivors describe the shock of being attacked by bombers behaving like fighters, closing the distance so quickly that defensive stations could not react. American crews described the surreal sensation of flying so low that ocean spray hit their windshields, trusting an airframe that was never meant to endure such stress. Yet beneath all the technical brilliance and raw courage lay a deeper transformation one that reshaped aerial warfare in the Pacific. Before these operations, Allied doctrine emphasized altitude and formation bombing. After them, commanders embraced low-altitude skip bombing, gunships, and flexible tactics born from ingenuity rather than manuals. Papillon's vision had changed not just a plane, but an entire theater of war. As the second day of combat arrived, Japanese destroyers attempted to shield the remaining transports by creating smoke screens and maneuvering aggressively. But the B-25s adapted. They came in from multiple angles, coordinating strafing runs that suppressed anti-aircraft crews. Skip bombs tore through hulls already stressed by days of combat. The sea burned with fuel slicks and smoldering fragments. Once again, the .50 caliber cartridges clattered across metal floors, every expelled casing symbolizing the endless capacity of a democratic nation to supply its fighters with the tools needed to challenge an authoritarian empire. Each round represented more than firepower. It represented the belief that innovation belonged to everyone, not just those in command. By the third day, the Japanese convoy was broken. Ships lay half submerged, listing to one side, their superstructures twisted. Survivors floated among debris, stunned by the ferocity of a weapon system they had never been warned about. They expected American bombers to behave predictably. Instead, they faced aircraft that shattered every assumption. The official post-action reports list 12 ships confirmed sunk. Some historians estimate even more suffered catastrophic damage beyond repair. These losses crippled Japan's ability to supply its forces in the Solomons, delaying operations and weakening garrisons already strained by the long campaign. Engineers who once questioned guns' modifications could not deny the results. The B-25 gunship had become a new symbol of American adaptability, a reminder that innovation often emerges from necessity, built not by perfect laboratories, but by individuals willing to defy limitations. In the months that followed, the gunship concept spread across the Pacific. New variants were produced, more guns added, more tactics refined. The impossible design became standard doctrine, and the .50 caliber shell smooth, heavy, unapologetically. Simple became the heartbeat of countless missions. These cartridges traced a line from factory floors in Detroit and Minneapolis to the jungles of New Guinea and the waters of the Solomons, forming a chain of effort stretching across an entire nation. As the war shifted toward eventual victory, pilots reflected on these early innovations with reverence, not because they were perfect, but because they represented something profound. The idea that democracy thrives when individuals are free to imagine beyond the manual, to challenge assumptions, to dare the improbable. And so the story closes where it began over a restless ocean, under a pale Pacific sun, with a gunship carving its path through history. The sound of the .50 caliber guns fades into memory, but their meaning endures. They represent more than firepower. They represent the strength of a free society capable of adapting, improvising, and overcoming. 12 Japanese ships lie beneath the waves as silent testimony, not simply to destruction, but to transformation, to the moment when an idea deemed impossible reshaped the course of a theater, inspired new doctrine, and reminded the world that freedom's greatest weapon is not machinery alone, but the imagination of those who refuse to accept limitations. In the quiet aftermath, as the sea swallows the last traces of battle, one truth rises above all, that in the vast arena of war, the power of a free mind armed with courage, resourcefulness, and the relentless rhythm of .50 caliber determination can forge possibilities where none were thought to exist. What followed in the days after Brody's first strike was not a pause, not a moment of recalculation, but something closer to a gathering storm. The B-25s of the 345th Bomb Group, young men and young aircraft, sat on the coral airstrips like tethered hawks. Their engines cooled, their bomb racks emptied, their gunners silent, but the air around them carried a strange electric pressure. Word spread through the group of what the improvised gunship had done, and some swore the sound of its guns still echoed faintly in the revetments, even when no aircraft moved at all. That sound, the rolling thunder of 8.50 caliber Brownings, had become a kind of symbol. America's raw, unapologetic ability to innovate under pressure. Because the Japanese convoys were not yet defeated. They were wounded, scattered, disoriented, but not destroyed. The waters north of New Britain still churned with their wakes, and radio intercepts hinted that Tokyo's command believed the American strikes were merely harassment, not the opening of a new kind of airborne assault they could neither predict nor counter. The truth was that even many Americans did not yet understand what they had unleashed. In the tented briefing rooms, officers laid charts on wooden tables and traced the line of the previous engagements. The Maboshutai convoy, one of the supply groups that fed Japan's fortified outposts, was supposed to pass unhindered. The imperial logs expected nothing more threatening than long-distance patrols. They had no column in their charts for a B-25 rigged like a sledgehammer. Brody's gunship did not fit into doctrine, calculations, or recorded patterns. It should not have existed. It should not have flown straight into a convoy defended by machine guns, deck-mounted cannons, and overlapping fields of fire. And above all, it should not have survived such an attack, much less crippled half the ships within reach. And yet it had. Contradiction between what was expected and what had happened hung in the air like humidity before a storm. American crews felt it every time they looked at their own traditionally configured bombers. Japanese commanders felt it every time they scanned the horizon, searching for the familiar silhouette of a Mitchell that now carried firepower equal to a small naval vessel. The next morning, when the sun rose over the Solomon Sea in a pale sheet of gold, Brody walked across the coral runway once more. The ground crew had finished rearming his aircraft in the dim hours before sunrise. On the hard-packed earth lay piles of spent .50 caliber shells, collected from the previous day, hundreds of them. They were no longer ammunition. There were symbols, physical evidence of unreasonable power delivered from the sky. Brody picked one up. It was blackened, dented at the mouth, still carrying the faint warmth of the last hours. That empty casing had once been a promise of destruction. Now it was the signature the B-25 had left behind on the... See, he slipped it into his pocket. That's symbolic. Cartridge and artifact of American. Abundance became the quiet reminder of what set this campaign apart. The Japanese expected American aircraft to strike once, maybe twice, then withdraw. They expected predictable bombing altitudes, predictable approaches, and predictable ordnance. What they did not expect was Gunship had fired so many rounds at its crews. Joked the aircraft might fly lighter. After each attack, what they did not expect was an enemy willing to reshape metal and purpose in the middle of a war zone. Japan's supply convoys had spent years moving through the Pacific with mechanical precision. They assumed their own doctrine, rigid, disciplined, and unchanging, was a shield. They assumed the enemy would fight within known parameters, that the Americans would not dare approach low enough to trade gunfire with entire decks of merchant escorts. But war is not the steward of assumptions. It rewards adaptability, relentlessness, and the strange, stubborn human belief that even the impossible can be built into metal. The order came just after sunrise. Another convoy had been sighted, scattered, attempting to regroup, trying to cling to the fragile pattern that had once protected them. The message arrived with coordinates written in haste, as though the officers who relayed it knew what was about to happen. The crew chief tightened the last bolts. The fuelers stepped away. The propellers began to spin. The gunship roared down the strip once more, its shadow sweeping across the palms dotting the Japanese convoy that awaited far to the north. The atmosphere could not have been more different. Sailors aboard the transports moved with brittle tension. Some had barely slept. Others had not eaten. The officers tried to enforce order, but the ocean itself seemed uncertain waves lapping softly one moment, slapping against hulls the next. The convoy no longer resembled the confident, rhythmic formation it had been at departure. It was now a drifting collection of frightened silhouettes. Attempts at radio coordination were stilted. Reports of American aircraft circulated like ghosts, contradictory, exaggerated, impossible to confirm. Some sailors believed the gunships were a temporary threat. Others whispered that the enemy had invented an entirely new weapon. Still others insisted that the B-25 must have been damaged and would not return. They were wrong. When Brody's aircraft approached the convoy, it came in low, so low that the tops of the waves blurred into streaks of silver beneath the fuselage. His crew scanned the horizon. Every man aboard felt the now familiar bark of adrenaline. And somewhere beneath their boots lay the symbol of their last mission, another handful of .50 caliber rounds, ready to be fired into history. The first Japanese vessel they sighted was attempting to blend with the coastline tactic that had once worked against high-altitude bombers. But the gunship ignored altitude entirely. It aligned with the ship's bow, dipped slightly, and fired. The 8 Brownings let loose their harmonic thunder, a sound so sustained and textured that some Japanese survivors later described it as a bladed wind, something that seemed to slice through both metal and morale. Rows of bullets punched into the hull, walking lines that carved through wooden decks and shattered crew positions. The Japanese anti-aircraft team struggled to respond. Their weapons were designed for higher, slower targets. Against the onrushing gunship, they might as well have thrown stones. The vessel erupted in flame. Its bow dipped. Its engines struck repeatedly, detonated in a gout of smoke and molten fragments. These were not the single precise hits of high-altitude bombs. These were hundreds of impacts delivered in seconds, and as the ship began to sink, Brody's aircraft did not climb away. It curved toward the next target dot far behind them. The ocean swallowed the wreckage, carrying with it the expectations Japan had once held regarding invulnerability on the sea. That day, the gunship made 6 passes on 3 vessels. 2 sank within minutes. 1, badly damaged, attempted to beach itself on a nearby island. Japanese sailors abandoned ship, some leaping into the water as smoke rolled over the deck like storm clouds. The American crews saw the flashes of small orange fire from survivors. But the gunship did not circle back. It banked north. Searching for the remaining ships, what happened next would stretch the limits of even the boldest tactical planning. The convoy's largest vessel, a 6,000-ton transport carrying ammunition, fuel drums, and supplies bound for Rabaul, attempted to flee at full speed. It was the kind of ship normally targeted by torpedo bombers or submarines. No B-25 pilot was ever expected to chase such a vessel down using machine guns alone. And yet, Brody's aircraft closed the distance. The gunship approached the transport from the stern. The Japanese crew fired desperately, their tracers rising in weak arcs that fell short. Brody kept the nose steady. The Brownings unleashed their sustained barrage. Bullets punched into the fuel drums stacked on the deck. One ignited. Then another. Flames cascaded across the ship like liquid sunlight. The decks buckled. The vessel trembled. And then, with a deep, awful groan, the transport broke in two. Somewhere in the middle of that moment, a spent .50 caliber casing rolled across the gunship's deck floor, bouncing lightly against the navigator's boot. He picked it up and held it for a moment, an empty cylinder of brass, a thing that seemed too simple to be capable of such devastation. But it was never the brass alone. It was the will behind it. By nightfall, the convoy's scattered pieces drifted like shadows. The sea, once carved with straight wakes, now bore only circles, eerie whirlpools where ships had gone down. Japanese command logs written later that week attempted to account for the losses, but even the officers compiling them hesitated. The reports contradicted known American capabilities. The damage did not align with previous patterns, and the sheer-scale 12 ships lost in 3 days violated every expectation. The Imperial Navy, head of the region. The gunship returned to base in darkness. Its engines coughed softly as the crew cut power. Ground personnel approached silently, as though witnessing something beyond simple mechanical success. Some counted the bullet holes in the fuselage. Others shook their heads at the sight of the empty ammo crates spent. Every one of them. That night, when Brody sat alone outside the briefing tent, he placed the spent cartridge he had carried all day onto the small wooden table beside him. He looked at it the way a historian might study a relic, or a soldier might regard a medal after the clamor of ceremony had faded. It was a reminder not of violence, but of transformation, how a war shaped men, and how men shaped the machines that fought it. Across the ocean, Japanese supply officers revised their planning procedures. Escorts were doubled. Routes were altered. Reports from survivors were studied with care, but they offered little clarity. Some insisted the American plane must have been modified beyond recognition. Others believed multiple aircraft had coordinated to appear as one. A few suggested that the Americans had developed a new class of attack, plain entirely. But the truth was simpler. It was a single idea, forged in improvisation, carried into battle by a handful of men, and proven across 3 days of relentless strikes. War had always rewarded preparation, but now it rewarded imagination. In the months that followed, the concept of the gunship spread. Modification lines grew bolder. Engineers who had once dismissed Brody's design as impossible now studied it with meticulous respect. New B-25s left the revetments with heavier armament, thicker armor, and a new doctrine that embraced low-level gun runs as a viable, even preferred, method of attack. The Pacific changed with them. Japanese convoys traveling under the cover of night no longer felt secure. Escorts strained their eyes along the horizon. Lookouts scanned the water for shadows. Every flicker on the surface, every glint of sunlight on a wave, felt like a warning, and as each new mission unfolded, the recurring symbol of the gunship, the spent .50 caliber casing, continued to rattle across floors, bounce under boots, or settle into pockets. It traveled with the crews. becoming a silent companion in a war defined by fire and ingenuity, because it represented something larger. It represented a nation's ability to outproduce, out-invent, and outlast. It represented the abundance of material and imagination that stood behind each mission. It represented the belief that democracy, when pressed, could build terrible and magnificent tools to defend itself. Years later, when veterans recounted those days, they rarely spoke of glory. They spoke of exhaustion, of fear, of the relentless heat and the impossible odds. But some also remembered the sound of the Brownings, how it started as a rapid, rasping roar and settled into a deep, rhythmic certainty, a sound that told them they were not fighting alone. And in the quiet after the guns fell silent, they remembered the casings, those small, unassuming cylinders of brass, scattered across the floor, like fallen seeds, seeds of a new doctrine, seeds of a shifting war, seeds of an idea that had once been called impossible. In the end, when history looked back on those 3 days, it did not see only the ships that were sunk or the tonnage loss. It saw the moment when an engineer's unlikely vision reshaped the battlefield, when a handful of men carried an untested weapon into the heart of danger, and when the Pacific War tilted ever so slightly toward a future where adaptability triumphed over rigidity. And somewhere, in a museum drawer or a forgotten footlocker, a single .50 caliber casing still rests silent, dented, and empty, a reminder of what can happen when fear is met with innovation, when scarcity is met with abundance, and when democracy, cornered, pressured, and tested, finds the strength not just to endure, but to create. A small object, forged in brass, a vast idea forged in freedom.